Okay, everyone. So in this lecture video, we're going to be talking about our articulation. So essentially what we're going to be looking at is where and how does our body move based on how the bones are put together and what are the things involved in putting bones together. So we've learned that when two bones come together, usually at places like condyles, different surfaces and things, right? They're going to move past each other in some kind of way to allow you that greater motion. Okay, so those things that we call articulations are also known as joints, right? These are points where two or more bones are going to meet together in order to carry out a particular function. In our case, carrying about some kind of movement. Okay, so with like any structure in the human body that we've addressed so far, the structure of that really does lead to the function of that particular feature. So in this case, when we're talking about the joint, right, the structure of the joint and how it's put together is going to determine what types of motion is able to be done at that area. Okay, so one thing to note is that with any kind of joint structure as we go forward, right, there's going to be potentially multiple kinds of motion that are going to be able to occur at that joint, right? And sometimes parts of the joint can behave similar to other kinds because they're working in tandem with other things, right? Just note that it gets a little bit complicated, but most of these things fall within a particular category. So the point of this video when we're talking about joints, right, we're really just mainly interested in what are the kind of the broad categories that joints fill, and then as we dive into it a little bit more, we'll talk more detail about each of the individual kinds of joints that exist there. Okay. All right. So in this, we're going to look at different structural classifications of joints. So what are the things that actually define the joint as a whole? Okay. So again, a structural classification is just based on the anatomical structure of the joint. Okay. So just like how it's put together. Okay. And there are several different types. So the first type that you are going to experience, and one that you guys have looked at already, is with a fibrous articulation. Okay, so a fibrous joint or articulation is a connection that uses fibrous connective tissue. Generally, what happens with these joints is they're not very motile in movement, and they're just kind of what happens when you have ossification in different tissues that kind of, again, fuse together to create those kind of mesh networks that get ossified. Okay. The next type that we have is cartilaginous. So a cartilaginous joint is a joint that has some kind of cartilage involved. So think like what's happening at your knees, what's happening at your elbow, right, in your shoulder. There's cartilage pieces that are there to allow for cushion, as well as generally a larger range of motion. All right, and then our last classification that we're interested in is a synovial joint. So that's O-V-I-A-L. So synovial connections use fibrous tissue and cartilage usually together to create high range of motion. So with the synovial joint, we'll spend a lot more time talking about that joint in particular, is where we're going to get kind of our big ranges of motion, our big emotions. Okay, kind of those big sweeping motions that we're looking at, those that are like, you know, if you're pushing a ball or kicking something, right, those are generally going to be occurring due to movement at a synovial joint. Okay, so one thing to think about with joints though is that the more movement you're able to have at that joint, the likelihood of injury also goes up. Okay, so that's one thing to think about as we move forward. Functionally though, so beyond just the structural pieces that are there, so again, being mostly fibrous connective tissue versus cartilage versus synovial, which is kind of like a mixture of both, you also have functional classification. So those are based on the ranges that you're using as you're defining those particular types of motion. Okay, so the type that we're kind of interested in are, we're really interested in kind of the functional things. So first you have the type of joint that's going to be a synarthritic joint or synarthrosis. So syn means together, arthro just refers to joint, like think arthropod, which means jointed foot, like insects have those, right? The arthro there is just all about the joint idea. Okay, so synarthrosis is where you have a joint that's unable to move. So that would be a fibrous joint, for example, like in your sutures. Okay. An amphiarthrosis is a joint where you're slightly movable. Okay, so amphi just means like both. Okay, so these types of joints, they're not going to be like super motile, like, you know, say if you're flexing your finger where you're experiencing a lot of stuff like this, right? An amphiarthritic joint is going to be one where there's slight movement, mainly just to provide some flexion or cushion in case there's impact or something there. Your pubic symphysis is an example where you have kind of an amphiarthrosis. As you walk, right, your hip joints will actually sway and move, so there is a little bit of flexibility in that particular joint. Okay. And then our last joint, the one that we're going to be looking at the most, is a diarthritic joint. So diarthroses joints are joints that are extremely motile, right? They're basically free movement, which allows the joints to move in any number of directions depending on the structural classification of it. And so these joints will think like your shoulder, your knee, your neck, right? Any of those are examples where you're going to have some kind of motion that allows for you to have extended kind of extreme movement as a whole. Okay, so those articulation points, really what I want to focus on then is just kind of like taking these functional classifications, right, and providing you a little bit more insight as to what's going on with them structurally, as well as what's going on with like more specific examples, especially of the synarthroses and the amphiarthroses. We're going to have another video that's looking at synovial joints specifically because, again, those are the main focus of what we're looking at. But it's important to know about these two joints and what they mean and bring to the table, because this collective motion, right, is going to allow you to do these kind of large sweeping things. Like even just picking up something, right, requires you to utilize all three different functional classifications of a joint. It's just that you're going to have some that are providing stability, some that are providing a little bit of movement, and some that are providing the largest amount of force transfer when you're going those particular ways. Okay, so let's look at different types of joints. Okay, so when we're assessing and looking at different types of joints, we're again thinking about the functional classifications as well as the structural classifications and what's going on with those particular joint structures. Okay, so we're going to start with the synarthrosis. So synarthroses, again, are joints that don't have any kind of particular motion. Okay, no movement, very strong because they provide a lot of stability. Okay, these are mainly there just to provide extra protection or are kind of leftovers from when we develop. So for example, when we mentioned sutures before, right, your brain, as you recall, is still kind of this modal moving, growing thing when you are born, right? And you also need flexibility in your skull if you're going through vaginal birth, where your skull is essentially getting like squished. So you need that flexibility there. But as you get older, right, you need that additional protection as you start doing crazy things like, I don't know, falling out of bed and jumping and stuff like that. You need those very strong joints to provide some kind of extra protection. So with our fibrous joints, there's a few different examples of those. So again, like a fibrous joint, like a suture, is a connection where you have that interlacing, like endofibril like ossification just going on between the different connective tissue webs that are inside of your skull and the fontanelles, right, in that feature. Again, these connections are kind of interlocked in the surface, right, and they provide a very strong surface. Like if you hit on your skull, right, that's going to be very rigid and not flex very much. Okay. Agomphosis is kind of a different kind of one. It's where you've got some kind of fibrous connection that inserts into kind of a socket. So think your teeth. Again, those are joints that where your bones are meeting your teeth, right? There's not a lot of flexion or movability there, right? And if there is some, you're either going to lose that teeth or something's going to fall out. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time with those, but those are another example of that particular type of joint. Okay. Let's talk about cartilaginous joints. So cartilaginous joints, again, provide some kind of motion that generally is compounded, right? A little movement in one, if you do that over multiple places, like say in your spine, you're going to get quite a bit of motion that's going to happen. So a synchondrosis is just where you have a cartilaginous plate that allows you to kind of flex and move. Epiphyseal cartilage, so like what's happening at the end of your your long bones, so like between your humerus, radius, and ulna, between your humerus and your shoulder. Again, those are places where you've got that cartilage that's there that's providing additional support and structure as you're looking at these synarthroses. Okay, again, this cartilage that allows for that motion isn't going to be very flexible, okay, but it's going to be there to provide you with additional cushion. Okay. If we're looking at amphiarthroses, right, these are joints that have little motion overall. Again, these are weaker compared to your synarthrosis, again, because they're providing some kind of movement. And again, as movement amount increases, so does your ability to injure it, all right? That's going to be more likely to suffer an injury, okay? So again, I'd say it's a weaker joint because of that. Because there is a range of motion, right, you're going to have some chance for particular injuries, okay? So when many of these are combined, you often get a very large range of motion as a whole. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. Okay, so an example of a fibrous connection would be a syndemosis. So syn means together, dem is kinda, osis means like, again, movement, kind of that idea. So ligamentous connections, such as with your tibia and fibula, right? There's still some flexion, there's still some movement, there's still some kind of like mobility that's there, right? Because of, say, what's going on in your foot, right? You need some kind of flexion there, right? Because if you get hit from the side, for example, from your fibula, if it was completely rigid and attached, right, you're going to get it broken quite a bit. Okay, but providing a little bit of flexion there helps lower the impact, lower the impulse that you're experiencing, so it doesn't break, right? With the cartilaginous ones, so such as a symphysis, excuse me, like what we talked about with the pubic symphysis, is a connection between that fibrous cartilage pad. So pubic symphysis, your spinal vertebra, again, these are amphiarthritic. There's a little bit of motion that's there, but like with your spine, for example, as you're going between each of those plates of cartilage that's between each of the vertebra, right? If you have a little bit of flexion at those, if you combine those all together, right, you end up with a very large range of motion, right? Like you can do a lot of different motion with your spine as you extend forward, or flex forward as you hyperextend back. Those different kinds of motion are available to you because of the different kinds of structures that are inside of those particular structures. Okay, so I'm going to give you this table that kind of summarizes a little bit about the amphiarthroses and diarthroses. It'll be a part of your resources that you can check on in a little bit later. Okay, so again, that's just a blanket overview, just kind of like the broad classifications of joints. So not talking about like the structural things, but more the functional pieces of those. In another video, I'll talk more about our last joint, which is a diarthrosis, and what's going on there in terms of synovial joints and why we look at those, and then talk a little bit more about specific types of synovial joints. Okay, thanks.